Chapter 5. The World. We have seen that the truth of the self will reveal itself when the mind persists in the quest of the self, actuated by the resolve to find that truth. This the mind can do if it be not deflected from the quest by extraneous thoughts. The mind that is not so deflected is an apt instrument for finding the self. In the case of the sage of Arunachala, the mind was such an apt instrument because it was untainted by desires or attachments which could raise a current of thoughts diverting the mind from the quest. For such a one, it is unnecessary to engage in discussions about the world. As Bhagavan has said, "Of what use are disputes about the world, saying that it is real, that it is an illusory appearance, that it is conscious, that it is insentient, or unhappy, or that it is miserable? All men alike love the egoless state, which is won by turning away from the world and knowing the untainted self, which transcends the assertions that it is one or that it is manifold." Here the sage makes a statement which at first would seem to be inaccurate. He says that all of us are lovers of the egoless state, which is to be won by turning aside from the world. And since we are to turn our backs on the world after all, it does not matter to us what the world may be. But few are the persons who have heard of the egoless state, and still fewer are those that want that state. What then does the sage mean by saying that all men without exception are devotees of that state? The sage himself has furnished the explanation, which is in perfect harmony with the teachings of the ancient lore. It is as follows. It is true that not all are conscious lovers of the egoless state, but unknowingly they do love that state, and they show that love by their great partiality to a state which has great resemblance to the egoless one, namely the state of dreamless sleep. This state is far inferior to the egoless state, as we shall see later. It is a happy state, but its happiness bears no comparison at all with that of the egoless state or samadhi. However, it is exactly similar to the egoless state in being egoless and wordless. It will be seen later that its egolessness is imperfect. Because it is egoless, it is also worldless, and this is which that makes it happy. The sage tells us that one that is in love with sleep, in spite of its imperfection, cannot be heard to say that he does not love the egoless state. For this reason, if only we knew what it is that we really want, it would be unnecessary for us to discuss the world. It is the self that should interest us, not the not-self. Therefore, says the sage, it is absurd to investigate the not-self, as it would be absurd for a barber to scrutinize the heaps of shorn hair, instead of putting it in the dustbin. All inquiries about the non-self are vain, if not mischievous, because it delays the main enterprise, the quest of the self. And this is so even if one arrives at the correct conclusion about the nature of the world, if he does not then at least commence that quest. But for those that are in earnest to find the self, without being able to pursue the quest with one pointed mind, this inquiry is neither unnecessary nor undesirable. The necessity arises thus. Most men, even those that are in earnest to be delivered from bondage, are hindered in the pursuit of the quest by unwanted thoughts that arise and fill the mind. The habitual flow of the mind is towards the world, not towards the self. Even when one succeeds in turning the mind away from the world and concentrating it on the self, it breaks loose and wanders back to the world. But why do thoughts intrude into the mind even when they are not wanted? The sages say it is because we have the belief that the world is real. The sage of Arunachala tells us in one of his compositions that, but for our belief that the world is real, it would be quite easy for us to obtain the revelation of the self. The greatest wonder, says the sage, is this, that being always the real self, we are striving to become one with him. And he tells us that a day will dawn when we will have to laugh at our present efforts to that end. But that which will be realized on that day of laughter exists even now as the truth. For we are not to become that self. We are that self. It may be asked what this belief of ours has to do with the quest. One reason is this. Whatever we hold to be real has an unquestionable right of entry into the mind. Thoughts regarding realities cannot be denied admittance by a mere fiat of the will. But that is not all. We now regard the world as real in a sense in which it is not real. And by so regarding it, we make it impossible for ourselves to realize the self until we give up our false belief. It so happens that the very thing that obscures the self for us is the world itself. How can that be? The sages tell us that the self, Atman, is the reality underlying the world. Just as when a rope is mistaken for a snake, the snake obscures the rope, so the world obscures the self. There is only one reality, which in our ignorance appears to us as the world, and will appear as it really is as the self when we transcend the ignorance. When we shall experience the truth, we shall find that what now appears to us as this multiple world of names and forms in time and space is just the real self, which is the indivisible reality, nameless, formless, timeless and spaceless, and also changeless. And it is axiomatic that appearance excludes the reality. That is, as long as the rope is supposed to be a snake, it cannot appear as the rope it really is. The false snake effectually conceals the real rope. The same is the case with the self. So long as the self appears to us as the world, we shall not realize that Atman as self. The world appearance effectually conceals the self, and it will do so until we get rid of the appearance. And we cannot do so unless we understand that the world appearance is unreal. For this reason, reality, which is also the self, is practically non-existent for him that believes the world to be real, just as the rope is non-existent for him that sees it as a snake. For this reason, he is an atheist, even though he may honestly believe that there is a reality. Thus it happens that because of this false belief, the self, Atman, which is infinitely great and blissful, and which is our dearest possession, if we may call that a possession, is for the time being lost to us. And what greater loss can there be? But the idea of a self is innate to us. It is not open to us even to doubt the existence of a self of some sort. The self is only indubitable reality there is. If anyone questions the reality of the self, he would at once put himself out of court. To be able to raise any question at all, he must admit he exists. Therefore it happens that, feeling the void due to the obscuring of the real self, we fill it up with a false self. But since the world is taken as real, and we are unable to think of any reality beyond the world, we have to locate this hypothetical self in the world. And this can be only by identifying the real self with the body. And as there are two bodies, the physical or gross one, and the mental or subtle one, we cannot escape taking one or both of them as the self. It needs to be understood that in both ways we fall into ignorance. The real self is neither the body nor the mind, as we shall see later. By this ignorance, we are disabled from conceiving of a real self which transcends both mind and body. Thus, unless we are willing to renounce the belief that the world is real as such, that is, as the world, we shall never realize the self that the sages have testified to. And this means that to get rid of the primary ignorance, we must renounce the belief that the world is real, unless our minds are of such exceptional purity and harmony that we can put away all thought about the world and the body while engaged in the quest. Therefore, we need to listen to what the sages tell us about the world and accept their teaching at least as tentatively true.